So our conversation today is part of a bigger project called A Window to Europe Through Literature and Art. So it was a series of exhibitions featuring 11 visual artists from the Washington, D.C. area who created art in response to 11 European artists. This exhibition series and the whole project is presented by Plainsight DC and the European Union National Institutes of Culture in Washington, of which Alliance Française is a partner. And this has been going on since September, actually. So this is the final stage. And we are very happy to have Sobia Ahmad with us, who was inspired by a French illustrator and writer, Laurie Agusti, and in particular her book, Sortie de Nuit in French, or A Night's Journey. And on the left, you can see Sobia's work. It's a weaving, and she will definitely talk more about what inspired her in this project. So Sobia Ahmad is an interdisciplinary artist whose work explores how our deeply intimate struggles of belonging can inform larger conversations about national identity, nations of home, cultural memory, and gender. Born and raised in Pakistan, Sobia Ahmad moved to the United States at the age of 14. She graduated with honors from the Bachelor's in Studio Art program at the University of Maryland, College Park, and her work has been exhibited widely from New York State to Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. Laurie Agusti studied art and is an illustrator, and she's unable to join us today. Her first book was published in 2014, and since then she has been illustrating books for adults and children, and she lives and works in Paris. So A Window to Europe is this intercultural project, meaning to bring artists and writers from very different backgrounds together and see what happens. So Sobia, my very first question to you is, what inspired you to create this work?
Hi, thank you, Natasha, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. My name is Sobia Ahmad, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, to answer your question, what inspired me to make this work? I have been working since 2018, early 2018, on a large series around this inner spiritual journey, and also its relationship to the way we live in the world and power structures, like socio-political power structures. And when I was paired with Laurie Augusti's book, the themes really resonated with me, especially the theme of fear and fear of the dark, that I felt like was very much a spiritual experience. And so I continued working on the series that I was working on from 2018. And for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a children's story book, actually. And it's beautifully illustrated. There's a butterfly that wakes up in the middle of the night and is hungry and is looking for food. But as the butterfly goes out to look for food, it becomes really afraid of the dark and not being able to recognize anybody in its surroundings. And then later, as it continues the journey, it finds friends and sort of understands that even in the dark, there are treasures to be found, like friendship and such things. So that really spoke to me, because I started relating to the book from that lens, and also this fear of the other that is very present for all of us globally right now. So inspired by my own personal history, my own experience of immigration, my own journey of sort of working through these ideas and themes in my own personal life and also in my practice, I started this large weaving that I had started before, but then I completed as I read the book. And it's a very large paper weaving. I've made it with India ink, and it's paper dyed in India ink in various different shades that I've woven together. And it's the size of my body. So it's the length of my body. And I was thinking about referencing not just the body as a place, as a landscape, but also prayer itself in the Islamic tradition, which I grew up with and I'm a part of. The prayer is usually performed on a rug that is usually the size of your body. And the act of weaving is actually very contemplative for me, and I'm very new to it, but I'm exploring how that itself can be part of the spiritual practice. So the meditative process of weaving it together and the shades that I used, the colors I used were sort of inspired by that. Yeah, that's how I made the work. It involved a lot of cutting paper and bending and weaving. I'm happy to answer any questions, any specific questions if somebody has about the process.
Yes, and me myself, actually, I just went to Mexico for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and we went to Oaxaca and to that very little town where everyone, men and women included, engaged in the process of weaving, and they weave carpets and they use natural dyes. And there was this very cute little museum we went to, and it explained the whole history of weaving, where it started, how it's now, what are the techniques used and everything else, what are the natural dyes. Some come from insects, actually. Anyways, I was fascinated. And maybe you can tell us a little more. How did you learn weaving? Is there any story behind?
Sure, that's a great question. First of all, I've been to Oaxaca and I've spent time in the town where a lot of that weaving happens in Teotitlán, and I have friends there, and it's a very very dear place to me. So I'm really glad you got a chance to go there. It's an incredible place to be if you want to learn about the history of weaving in Mexico and the traditional patterns. So like I said, I'm very new to this process. I was actually drawn to it from the perspective of trying something new and trying to understand something that I was curious about, but not really trained in any way. And paper weaving, especially this kind, though laborious, is very simple because it's, straightforward. I'm cutting paper and weaving it up and down. So I think the process itself is very much about figuring out how do I sort of get the colors and get the textures that I want. And the reason why I was drawn to weaving to begin with is because of my, upbringing and my family history. I had these, dreams about my grandfather's rice fields that were sort of drawing me back to my ancestral imagination and ways of being. And I started looking into household objects that were part of my childhood. And a woven bed came to my mind that was very much the center of life in our courtyard, the courtyard of my childhood home in Pakistan, where I grew up. So I started thinking about weaving itself as a way of connecting with my ancestral rituals and that way of life. So I don't know a lot of traditional patterns and weaves at the moment, but I did on this recent trip to Pakistan, I did learn how to weave that bed. So that's something I'm working on now. And yeah, which is the reason why this talk was a little delayed because of this trip and international flights being really complicated during COVID. So yeah, my relationship to weaving is very new, and I'm actually enjoying being a beginner at something because it's bringing me back into my body, and I'm finding so many interesting ways of approaching a creative idea when the skills aren't really there. So I think the body and the mind are sort of learning together.
To continue with the subject, we have the first question from the chat, I believe from Sarah herself, unless she received this question from someone else. Anyways, was the weaving and the making of carpets a theme linked to your faith? Prayer carpets are very beautiful.
Sure, to an extent. I mean, as you can see in the imagery of the weave, there isn't a very strong sort of reference to, a prayer rug, traditional prayer rug, but I think the reference is present with the body itself and the size of it. So I actually collect prayer rugs from various parts of the world. They mean a lot to me, and I love being able to look at different cultures through this one object and how it's woven, and the colors that are used, or the traditional patterns and the designs in different parts of the world. So yes, Islamic mysticism, especially Sufism, is a huge influence. And for me, and in my practice and my work and in my personal, spiritual path as well. So that was very much part of, my thinking as I was working in the studio.
Thank you. So we'll take more questions from the chat later, but let's go back in history a little more. And can you tell us more about your story in general and what made you become an artist? When did it start?
I think most artists will tell you that they have always sort of, been creative since they were young. And I think that was the case with me too. I remember drawing with watercoloring, when I was very young. I have this vivid memory of deciding at age, I think 11, that I was going to the National College of Art in Pakistan. I didn't know I was going to end up in the US as a child, but I declared that to my family that I was going to be an artist, apparently. I did lose that when I got here, and I studied public health, and I have a background in public health, which informs my interest in community engaged art and social practice, and art being this tool for raising awareness about issues, or co-creating and collaborating in community. So I would say that my interest in art was, from a very young age, but I didn't think for a very long time that I could make art and follow this path as I am now, and I'm grateful that I am.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned the community engaging and socially engaged art. So can you tell us more about your studio, how you work, and also most importantly, how you're navigating the pandemic?
Thanks for that question. It's been challenging, and it's it's kind of a mixed bag. If there are moments then that I recognize that are very precious, like slowing down is something that I didn't get a chance to do before the pandemic hit. And it was kind of like a forced sabbatical that some of us took, because it's quite frankly, it's not the easiest thing to support yourself as an artist in in a community, or in a social environment that there is not a lot of funding for arts, or there's not a lot of interest in that sort of support. There's no networks, really strong networks, but we hold on to community in that way, and look out for each other. So the pandemic was hard in many ways, because a lot of exhibitions and projects were canceled and postponed, and there was funding involved in that as well. But there were also great opportunities where a lot of organizations came together to support artists and give emergency grants, and I'm grateful for that as well. In terms of the making of the work, the pandemic for me personally helped me slow down, and I became more interested in slow making and being with the work in a deeper way, and sort of going inwardly. I think that's something I had been wanting to do, but never really felt like I could make time for. So yeah, in that way, I feel like I'm sort of a little disengaged from social media at the moment, and I sort of took a step back from that just to be quieter, and that's been good. And the weaving part actually sort of grew during the pandemic for me. Behind me is a project that actually started during the pandemic. I started thinking about, I was living very close to to Rock Creek Park in DC at the time, and spent a lot of time among the trees. They became my community, really, when we couldn't really be around each other. So in that contemplative space of being in nature, I realized that our inner landscape, our inner emotional landscape, and our outer realities, and what was emerging in the world like, racial uprisings along with the pandemic were sort of all intersecting to inform our sense of here. And here became a very interesting idea to me. And I started inviting others through virtual workshops into that sort of, space. And I started a weaving project, but I'd mail out materials to people and they would bring their own materials and we'd just sit on Zoom and weave together. And then they're sending their weavings back to me that I'm sort of organizing into a larger body of work. So yeah, it's been stimulating in that way to sort of reimagine what making can look like in a time of social distancing. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you found other ways of reconnecting with the other artists in the audience. And I really like what you said about being here and appreciating this and sort of really not taking it for granted, right? But I guess for all of us, despite all the hardships of the pandemic, it really made us slow down and appreciate the current moment more. And so, a follow up, more practical question: can you tell us more about how where do you find inspiration in general and these days, and how do you go about implementing your ideas? Can you walk us through your creative process?
Sure. It's different for each project. Sometimes, I think from 2016 until 2021, early 2021, a lot of my work uh, was very much focused on the political climate and sort of responding to what was unfolding around me, around all of us. Um, from a very personal perspective, and also sort of inviting community into reflection through making the work. So I think life itself at that time is sort of providing the inspiration, so to speak. I read a lot of poetry, and I consider poetry like a primary source that I consult a lot, and that inspires a lot of my work. Sometimes poetry finds its way, in language and text, in the work, and sometimes it just inspires an idea. So I think there was a question in the chat about, light and dark, and there's a lot of Sufi poetry, Islamic Sufi poetry around this notion of light and dark being parts of ourselves that are, either known or not known. So, that has stayed with me for a few years, and that's something I've sort of, exploring in my work now. And sometimes inspiration comes randomly, like from a dream or something. Like, this project about the weaving sort of actually emerged from digging deeper in that. And the process of making is not always smooth. There's a lot of experimentation with materials. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So yeah, it depends on each project, and sometimes some materials convey messages better than others. So there's a lot of trial and error.
Yes, maybe right now to piggyback on that question about darkness, let me read it out aloud. Could you elaborate on the fear of darkness? Is it linked to your immigration story? In Islam, there's a pray at night, Isha. Does it help overcome the fear of darkness? And Sarah personally misses the call of Mitzan from her trip to Jerusalem.
Okay. I so when I refer to the fear of darkness, I'm actually talking about all sorts of darkness, like fear of the other, fear of the unknown, and darkness is this idea of something we're not familiar with, and I'm not only referencing to that in a spiritual way, but also in a social way, in a political way as well. I think for me, the two are inseparable, and something that's very present for a lot of us right now, and in our global reality is this fear of those who are different from others, from us, and so this idea of self and the other is also part of that darkness, for me, and how I conceptualize that. So when I read the book, I immediately thought of this idea of suspicion that we have, and when we meet someone that we don't know yet, and we're not familiar with, their inner world or their culture or their background, and just by the way they look, there's so much that we assume about them. And I think on a, you know, that interpersonal level, but then that is being enacted on very large scale, you know, with, like, you know, globally, there's the refugee issue at the moment, and there's the, you know, there's racism. So I'm thinking about this, you know, darkness from various perspectives, and how that sort of plays out in our world, and how intimately it's connected to our personal stories, and our relationships with each other. I hope that answered the question. And I think part of the question was about the prayer. And yes, I mean, prayer. I'm very interested in prayers. You know, not just you know, in a religious context, but prayer. In addition to that, you know, prayer as a container for understanding our own needs and our desires, and sort of naming them, or you know, making the act of making in the studio as prayer itself. And I also, you know, the call to prayer that you mentioned, I also miss that from Pakistan. That is one thing I also miss, because there's something very mesmerizing about it. It's almost like it's like beckoning you towards like spiritual awakening.
And calming. I miss that too from my trips to the Middle East. It really has this calming effect on you. At least that was my impression. And what you said about fear of the other made me think of another art conversation we had 2 weeks ago with Sean Silberstein, who wrote a wonderful book on art insight, understanding art, how to understand art, and where she says that we naturally tend to go away from something we don't understand, something which is which we don't know, something which is unfamiliar, and how art helps to understand it, to reflect on yourself at the same time, and not hurry into judging, but really looking, really looking and seeing. And for my next question, I would like to quote Marcel Proust in Remembrance of Things Past. He says, "Artists show the rest of us what matters. They often are unsure of what will happen when they enter the unknown territory to create landscapes that would otherwise have remained unknown." So I'm curious whether you agree with this statement, and how often do you go into the unknown, and what makes you feel confident to go there?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with that to an extent. I think all of us actually, whether we identify as artists or not, visual artists or not, go in that sort of unknown. I think life itself, you know, even if you're, I don't know, an elementary school teacher, there is this element of the unknown, in, you know, in that, you know, you don't know what kind of encounters you're going to have with the young lives that you're supposed to sort of shape in a way, right? So I wonder if there's sort of, you know, we could expand this idea of, because artists aren't just, you know, like special in that way. I think we're all sort of navigating this unknown in our own ways. But for the creative process, you know, speaking, you know, specifically of the creative process, that is, I mean, it's a very terrifying place sometimes to be, you know. It's like going deeper in a place to look for meaning where you are not sure there is meaning all the time. And that's a very vulnerable place. I sometimes find myself doubting the, you know, like why I do this, or if there is a, you know, if there is a purpose to this, or if there is value to it. So there is doubt. That's part of the process as well. And I think the unknown for me is also sometimes the in-between place. So the part, you know, being an immigrant in the U.S. is, I was recently back in Pakistan, where I was born and raised, after almost 10 years. And it affirmed for me that this in-betweenness is a very real place, even if it is not a place. And to be in between languages, to be in between cultures, to be in between, you know, almost like civilizational history, it's very rich, and that the unknown aspect of that is I don't know what kind of pull I will have to either world, and how do I sort of navigate that is really daunting at times. But I also find it to be a very rich place at the same time. So I guess for me, it's just this like trust that I have to have that something will emerge if I just try and let go of control. Yeah, and sometimes, on a practical level, you don't know if some project is going to work when you embark on it and you invest a lot of time and energy in it. And that, the unknown also comes up in that way. But there's something pulling you towards it, and you just answer that call.
I totally agree about what you said, in between, finding yourself in between cultures sometimes, not knowing where you actually belong. And totally. Anyways, I think I forgot what I wanted to say, but my next question is about the audience. If we can talk about that, and what part does it play in your work, and do you consider the viewer's perception while creating a new project, and does it shape the meaning of your work, thinking about people who will view your art will be your audience?
Yeah, sure. So I'll share a little bit about that process, and I think there are a couple of images that we also have that I can, talk about specific projects that the audience is part of. So if you go to the next few images, so this is an image of an installation that I did in 2018. So if you scroll to the next image, I can talk about the details of it. Yeah, so this one, as you can see, here's an audience member directly picking up the work and touching it, which is something you don't normally see. So this work actually came from, the period during which, there was a lot of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant rhetoric taking place in the US. And for me, I was trying to understand the sort of, like the layer underneath that, and understand how the legal language itself is used to create notions of the other and justify and perpetuate that othering. So in early 2017, a travel ban was passed that banned travel to the US from several predominantly Muslim countries, and I just wanted to understand why it took place. So I started inviting, people to submit their ID photos, people who identified as Muslim immigrants. So that, the aspect of sort of inviting others to share the process of making was really important, because it felt like a collective experience that had to be created, explored, and sort of just sat with collectively. And from that came this work, which is, in June of 2018, the Supreme Court upheld the ban, and it was not declared unconstitutional. And I wanted to know why. So I started reading the document from the court hearing, and then extracting language out of it to create a found poem about aliens. And I started repeating that poem, and it sounds really absurd when you repeat a word like, over 100 times. So that's what this is. But then I invited people to engage with the work and pick it up and dissolve that language, which is kind of this futile activity. There's nothing really that happens, but it's just the idea of getting people to directly, touch the work and be to be a part of sort of the conversation in a way. So if you go to the next image, I can share a little bit about that as well. Yeah, so this this work is actually a collaboration with my grandmother, and and there, these are what I call non-flags or counter flags or anti-flags. And the work also has a component that's an audio component. And those are stories of my grandmother and I just talking about this notion of home. And, in this work, I chose not to translate or provide, a transcript of the audio, because it's in Urdu and Punjabi. And I thought that was important to me, but also the diaspora sort of engaging with the work to sort of have that container. So I think the audience as part of the work is sort of a decision I make based on the project and the context that I think is important for the viewer. Yeah.
Thank you.
The question.
Yes, thank you. These are very interesting collaborations. And as you said, you even worked on this project with your grandmother, right? Which is great. And so maybe um, my couple of more questions before we move on. And I remind you that you can enter any questions you would like in the chat. Meanwhile, so I think you sort of talked about that already, but maybe just to wrap it up, and I don't know if you have any more ideas on that. You say that in your work, you map how the personal and the political intersect. So do you want to say anything else about that? And also maybe my broader question is like, what kind of satisfaction art brings to you? Why do you create art?
So the personal and the political, I'll talk a little bit about that first. Every time I try and understand a very, what seems to be a very personal and a very, very intimate struggle, I can never separate it from, the larger realities around me, be they, politics or culture or religion or law. And I'm always trying to understand, like, the thread. And for me, I've realized that, those, power structures, they really affect our personal narratives, and especially, in my experience, from persecution to migration to, being a woman of color in the US, being Muslim. And, so that experience has informed a lot of how my life is, has been both as an artist and just as a human. So I think they're so inexplicably connected that teasing out the nuances of that is what I'm really interested in. And for example, the last project I shared, the flags, the non-flags, they, are not just about my story and my grandmother's story, but they're actually about a larger story and this hyper-nationalism, this wave of hyper-nationalism that's taking place around us globally. So the work is very much rooted in this longing for, this desire for home, and home from various perspectives, like, a geographical home, a spiritual home, but at the same time, understanding and transcending limited notions of home and how geography has this, rhythmic uncertainties associated with it, especially for migrants and immigrants and refugees. So my grandmother and her experience of migration from India to Pakistan during the 1947 partition may seem like a very personal experience or a personal story, but it's very much connected to a larger story around, nation states and nationalities defining who we become in our stories. And then my migration from Pakistan to the US is also connected to power structures and legal procedures. So that's what I mean by, the various ways the personal and the political intersect. And I'm sort of interested in understanding how, those structures shape us and how responding to them also, changes us. And the second part of your question, sorry, I forgot the second part. Can you remind me?
Why do you create art? What is the satisfaction for you?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really just to find meaning, and I mentioned earlier too, it feels like a form of worship to engage in that process of entering the unknown and just being with that. And I think art is also a great way to be in the gray area for me and not think in black and white, which can be very easy to do. It's harder to embrace the complexities sometimes, and that's the goal. It's a great way to connect. I think it's also a very humbling thing to, to know that I don't know. And maybe if in the process of making, I may stumble upon something Um, I think the satisfaction also comes from the community, being able to be around people who are engaged in any creative, thing, and I really value having other artists and writers and poets who are sort of thinking and helping sort of raise consciousness, and I learn a lot from my peers, so that's also a very satisfying thing. Um, yeah, and learning, research and learning, it's very satisfying.
And how do you find the art scene in as an artist in DC? I don't know if you can compare. I saw that you had exhibits in other parts of the country, in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I don't know if you had a chance to work there as well. But what how do you find the cultural scene, art scene here in DC, and if you can compare it to other places?
Yeah. Um, I haven't lived there, in other parts of the US for a long period of time, as long as I've lived in DC and Maryland, the DMV area that we refer to it. As so DC feels like home in that way, it's very diverse, and I really value the diversity. Um, and I have been to the parts of the country where, there, of course, the art scene is larger. But what I really appreciate about DC is the intimate nature of the community. There's close relationships and close networks. And I have deep friendships in the area, so I really appreciate that. I have exhibited in other parts of the country, but I don't think I have a lot of connections there, so I can't really say what the community is like without having lived in a place. Um, it's very I'm very grateful for the community in DC.
Thank you. And actually, someone just sent me a question to myself, so you can see it in the chat. But they were asking about to talk about more about the project, actually. So let me just send this link right away. So the project is called A Window to Europe through Literature and Art, and there were many partnering organizations in this project, including Plainside DC. And Plainside DC, this is a small nonprofit, and I mentioned that in the beginning, part of the project was that art will be exhibited, and the idea that during the pandemic you can really go in safely at this big crowds of people. So what Plainside DC did, they have an actual window, like a show window, and everybody can come, and this is basically art all the time. And so they continue doing different kinds of exhibits there, but through September to January they've been doing a Window to Europe project, and every month there would be a different artist, and it will be like an installation. So and Sobia Ahmad's art was there in the beginning of January. And so yeah, that was the idea behind, so that everyone, that's accessible, everyone can come and see. And yes, Sarah?
Yeah, sorry, because I have hardly any voice left. Plainside DC was the local organization that was working with the EUNIC, European Union National Institute of Cultures, of which Alliance Française is a member. So it was along the way that Sobia mentioned collaboration. It was a collaboration between EUNIC and Plainside DC. There is a question from Luis. What can cultural institutions be doing better to promote artists and the arts more generally?
It's a lot there's a lot I could say, but I think the first thing I would say is really value artists as cultural producers, and not, as sort of not valuing art as a commodity, but also essential to our lives. That's something I think a lot of artists struggle with. This, at least for myself, I'm not as interested in art as just a product or a commodity, but art as a way of life. And I think engaging with cultures, engaging with cultural institutions, just prioritizing the artist and their vision instead of, you know, just an exhibition or just an event. I also think there could be a lot better funding for arts and support and networks. There's a lot of, you know, grant making organizations, but I think there could be a little bit more support for emerging artists as well. I also think that our academic system needs to reevaluate how we talk about and engage with art, not as, you know, an extracurricular topic, but more as absolutely essential to our experience as humans.
In your opinion, Sobia, it's different. Okay, the situation in Europe. That's why I'm bringing Europe to the table, actually, because in France we have a Ministry of Culture. I think there is one as well in Germany and in other countries. And so in most European democracies, even where there is no Ministry of Culture, there are always organizations and governments. And for instance, in France, you have le Centre National de la Cinématographie, which actually subsidize movie directors, emerging movie directors. But you also have, and that's a national center, but you also have local, either at the region level, which would be like the equivalent of the state in the United States, and then at the département level, which would be the you know, the county, and then at the town level. So at every ladder, I mean every step of the ladder in France, you are, as an artist, you are able to get subsidies, to get funding for as an emerging artist. And also, if you're like a performing artist and your work is interrupted by the pandemic, you will get some, like I know I've got a few friends who work in cinema, and including a costume designer, and of course, les intermittents du travail, we're called in French. So they have certain rights and certain help, you know, financial help from the government. So I think the situation in the United States is very different than it is in Europe, for that matter. The only, I would say, drawback from the situation in Europe, and in particular in France, when it comes to cinematography, cinema, is that it looks to some of the newer generation of movie makers who are a little bit more provocative, probably, that the government, and through that National Center for Cinema, always subsidizes the same kind of movie makers, and therefore creating, and including the same thing for actually visual artists or performing artists, like sculptures and installations. They are funding always the same, which means like they're almost creating a sort of academic art, which in the US obviously won't happen because there is no national institution, maybe except for the NEA and the NEH funding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yeah, we need more, you know, like local ecosystems around, you know, art and culture in the US more. And I have heard from a few friends and colleagues who, you know, been to Europe and have lived there and worked there, that there's a lot more support in other ways there. Yes.
I have my question. What are the projects you're working on right now?
So I am working on a large-scale weaving project. I visited my childhood home and said goodbye to it, and it was, you know, I'm not sure if I'll be able to ever go back, but I went and really wanted to sort of be in that courtyard, in that bed that has sort of kept me really on my toes, you know, for the last couple of years. I've learned how to make that, and now I'm working on this project with my grandmother and learning to, you know, how to make this and weave this. So teaching myself weaving is something I'm working on, and also it's a multimedia project. I'm, you know, doing a lot of research and the history of it and various ways this bed has been used in cultural settings and domestic settings, and in my family history, but also across the subcontinent. So that's something I'm very invested in right now. It's sort of taking up all my energy at the moment. Something else I'm doing is teaching myself woodworking, which is very exciting to be in the wood shop and just be a beginner at something that I, didn't learn a lot of that in the, earlier. So I'm doing that and finding it very difficult and exciting at the same time. And I have some ongoing projects that I continue. So I have some collaborations with artists. What else? Yeah, there are several moving parts to the practice, but right now I'm focused mostly on weaving and learning some skills that were held in my family that my family members, my grandmother and my aunts who are now scattered all over the world are sort of sending me patterns for the weavings and telling me stories about various beds they're inherited or woven or so it's kind of a multi-generational sort of project, and it's changing my studio practice in really magical ways. I'm thinking a lot about the importance of storytelling in creating a shared experience, and having family be a part of that is very satisfying, and it's a pretty new thing for me.
There's a question from Lourdes. I'm not sure I understood the question very much, Lord. Do you mean does Sobia know new forms of collaboration developing among visual, performing, and literatists? And if so, how? Is that what you meant? Because it looks like it goes, does she knew? And I'm not sure whether it was the preterite tense or whether it's the present. That's why. Lourdes, I see you here. Can you ask your question verbally? Because I'm afraid I'm asking the wrong question.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sana. Yes. Well, yes, the question is whether she sees new forms of collaboration developing among different kinds of artists, meaning visual, the performing, the literary artists. Certainly some of that has been done, but with this being such an era of change, does she see some new forms of art developing, new ways that artists in different fields are working together?
I'm not sure if this is directed at my practice specifically or in general what I'm witnessing, but yes, I definitely see a lot of collaborations taking place between fields that weren't before, communicating or wasn't there a lot, wasn't a lot of overlap between the two. There's a lot of public art focused on the refugee experience right now, which I'm following and very invested in, and pairing a playwright or a poet with actors to sort and community members to sort of create some sort of an experience for the public to understand and sort of develop empathy. So that's something that I'm seeing right now. There are a couple of projects, one in DC and one in Pittsburgh, that I've been following around that. And there's a lot of other creative work happening around art and technology. I'm not the most familiar with technology in that way or use it in my practice so much, but I do have colleagues and friends who are invested in that. There's lots of different overlaps that I'm seeing. I'm personally very interested in seeing how social practice and community engaged art can sort of enter the dimension of advocacy and activism and social change. So there's lots of organizations in DC. I worked with a few of them around the time the travel ban was passed, and they were, they invited poets and writers and performers and visual artists to come, work with them on initiatives around repealing the ban, for example. So that's the kind of work that I followed for a few years myself.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. One from Jacob.
Pleasure being here. Thank you to the Alliance Française. And you mentioned during your talk about a place when creating, and gave a specific example when he went back to Pakistan after 10 years. And I was wondering, what's the wealth of that in-between place when you create?
It's a place that has a lot of beauty and can also feel like a burden at times, if I'm honest. And I think that is the, you know, the complexity of that is where a lot of the work emerges from for me. And I think it also gives me a window into, because I'm, you know, it's not unique to me, that experience of that in-between place, you know, just, and I don't think migration is the only way one feels in that in-between place, you know. Exile can happen even if you never leave your country, you know, or the Black experience in the US is, you know, very much, you know, it's what I'm talking about is like, you know, this precarious nature of existence is not just unique to my story or only immigration. That is just the lens through which I'm able to look at it, and it allows me to sort of have empathy and sort of a multidimensional sort of perspective. So I think the richness actually comes from the place of knowing that it is, you know, this transition and this loss and this longing is inevitable, and it's universal in a different way, you know, for everyone. So there's some comfort there in that. And I think the richness of that place is that it constantly, you know, keeps me searching. And I think it's just, you know, the seeking or the searching is really what the creative process becomes about. If that makes sense. I have no idea if that makes sense.
No, it does, totally does. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Of course, of course.
And maybe the very last question, as we are running out of time, any art openings you would recommend to any of us to visit?
There's a great Laurie Anderson exhibit at the Hirshhorn. I think everyone should check that out. And also, I think the Hirshhorn also has another exhibit by Toyin Ojiotola. I hope I'm pronouncing their name correctly. So those two exhibits are on my list, so I would recommend everyone to check them out. And there's also another great website called Folio DC, and you can find several institutions on there, from, you know, the Hirshhorn and the Phillips collection to smaller galleries that, and it updates I think every few weeks of current exhibits.
Thank you so much, Sobia, for being with us, for talking about your work, art in general. Thank you everyone who joined. So